My name is Evangeline Ciupek. I'm the Professional Development and Resource Specialist at the Office of Research Development here at FSU. I would love to welcome our guest presenters. Dr. Lisa Chadwick joined the National Human Genome Research Institute's Extramural Research Program as a program director in 2018. She oversees the Centers for Mendelian Genomics within the NHGRI Genome Sequencing Program. And prior to joining NHGRI, Dr. Chadwick was a program director in the Division of Extramural Research and Training at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, where she was involved in the leadership of the NIH Roadmap Epigenomics Program and the NIH 4D Nucleome Program. I hope I said all of those words correctly. And then I'd also like to introduce Dr. Debra Fadool. She is the Nancy Marcus Professor and Associate Dean and Director of Postdoctoral Affairs, as well as a Professor and Associate Chair of Biological Science at FSU. She is the Principal Investigator of the Debra Fadool Laboratory Program in Neuroscience, has served as a panelist and reviewer for NIH since 2002, and has received 25 years of continuous funding from NIH. Dr. Fadool, Dr. Chadwick, thank you for being here today. I will hand the presentation over to you.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting myself and Lisa to chat with you today. And it can be completely informal. So if you want to stop us anytime along, it's not a very big group. If you want to take off your mic and ask a question or drop something in the chat, please do. Okay. All right. So I thought I'd start out with some statistics. These were the newest ones that I could find, even though it's a bracket of years some time back. But how you read this is the blue is what's called a type 1 application. So that is someone who is putting in a new application. And then the green is someone who is putting a competing renewal in. And we've all heard that competing renewals have a greater success rate. And you can see that from this graph. But what you see below is the score, the A1 score, like what you initially get on your grant. If you're in this bracket range, whether you're a new proposal or a competing proposal, you see that if you bring it back in, if you resubmit, so this is the A1 award rate, then you have about a 60 to 70% chance of getting that grant application renewed if you come in with a, up to 30 percentile. The incidences go lower and lower as you go through. Okay. One of the things that you read is that if your grant is not discussed, then there's just no chance of getting it funded. And you can see that the chances are lower. But I actually have had a grant that went from not discussed to funded. And so it's not impossible, but you have to be really strategic about it. I remember I was at study section and we were all at lunch and people were discussing, should they resubmit, should they do this or that? And someone said, oh, well, if you're not discussing, you better just not even worry about it. And I just kind of went like this because I was doing that and it went through. So here's another way of looking at these statistics. And so this just shows you the same pattern. You've got the type 1 and the type 2. So these are your competing renewals, and these are in blue are your new awards. And this uses a different metric. So it's the chance of getting a grant on either the first attempt or the second attempt divided by just the first attempt received. And so the previous one has a little bit lower rates because it is looking at all of the different resubmitted second applications. Okay. All right. So how do you decide whether you should resubmit? Well, the first thing you've got to do is really analyze your summary statement. And I know it's really hard to do. We all hate to get our summary statement back. We hate, we keep checking the ERA Commons. But once you open it up, if it's not favorable, just put it on the side of your desk for a few days or a couple of weeks. and read it over and over, because each time you read it, you have a different level of emotion and you start to see things more clearly. The next thing you want to do is call your program officer, and it is wonderful that we have a program officer to give us the backside of that today in our webinar. And you want to share your summary statement with your research team. It doesn't matter how experienced or inexperienced your research team is. They will all have a different set of eyes, and they will help bring back feedback. Then you want to plan your reattack, and you have about a 37-month window. That's the time limit before you can't resubmit again. Okay. So let's look at this a little bit. I thought the thing that we could do is we could look at my critiques, because, you know, I've just resubmitted a grant. It's a normal process, okay? And so these are some of the scores that I got on my grant. So what you want to do is you want to identify at a glance where your application is strong and where it is weak. And by moving across the reviewers, then you can judge the uniformity of your review. It will help you decide whether you should resubmit. Should you submit to a new funding mechanism instead? Is there something, this is something that you should really decide on early on. And so what I suggest to do is take your 3 reviewers. Here's your significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. And then just write out their scores. So this was my score for my first reviewer. This was my score for my second reviewer. This was my scores for my third reviewer. So then you can really see where your problem lies. In order to get funded in today's climate, you need all 1s and 2s and an occasional 3. Okay. But you can see that in this grant that I just submitted, and I resubmitted it on March 5th, my problem lies with approach. Okay. Approach is something that's a lot easier to fix than significance. So this guy really didn't like my significance, but it might have been pulled down from my approach. The other 2 reviewers were okay with my significance. The significance is kind of at the heart. So if they're not enthusiastic, if the significance score is low, then it's really hard. You see that there's they're happy with investigator, innovation, they're pleased with the environment that we have at FSU, but I really had to look at approach. So I'll pull up my sheets and we'll take a look at them, okay? So by looking across the panels, you can judge the enthusiasm of the reviewers. Are they giving you a lot of details, or are the critiques kind of general, okay? Because they only have so much time, and maybe they just don't feel like putting a lot of effort into it. They're not enthusiastic, and you can tell that by the tenor of the reviews. So really read and reread your summary statement. Share it with the members of your team. Devise a plan and redevise that plan. All right, so here's my summary statement, okay? So you can see I have a 39, so it's not that first histogram, it's that second histogram. So if I submit this and look at it and study it, you know, I've got a 50% chance of getting funded if I shove it back in, okay? All right, so let's go down here and see. This is just what I wrote, so you guys are familiar with that. All right, so here's my first critique that I showed you that I put in the table. So this individual, again, the thing that you really got to look at is approach, okay? See where your strengths are, see where your weaknesses are, okay? Then what I do is I write all over it, and I write my thoughts on it. Sometimes my thoughts change, and then my team, they can see what my thoughts are, and they can see where we're going. So I've made some suggestions for experiments. We could test this. Here we really need new data, okay? We need to do this. We need to put on a toxin. We need to do these types of recordings. We need to put in new images because they're not seeing the target, okay? So I make lots of suggestions all over. And then we go to things that are not experimental, things that I've got to do with words, okay? And I just write little comments all over this to try to figure out what our strategy is, okay? Sometimes they're not exactly right, but you want to take the high road and figure out the most carefully worded introduction to go back in, okay? New data, so on and so forth. So remember that this one was the one that was the toughest, okay? So let's look at this one. You see they're not writing too much when it comes to all those other categories, but when it comes to the approach, they're writing a lot. And so they're writing a lot of details. And so I've got to address these details, okay? Here it says that, you know, my experimental rate here, I know not everybody's in the same field, is not very good. And how do I know it's going to be enough to produce a functional defect? But this is really good. And they just aren't understanding it. So I have to explain it better because not everyone is in the same field, even in that study section. Okay. Here they suggest that I put in a table. So I tell them it's a great idea. Let's do that. Okay. So on and so forth. You get the idea. Then after reading my critiques, I have to decide if I'm going to resubmit. Okay. And so this is kind of the things that I would talk to my program officer. So at this point, I'm going to shift over to Lisa because she'll tell you what she discusses with people when they call in. And then I'll come back and tell you what I plan and talk to with my program officer.
Okay. Well, Debbie, I'm glad that Debbie and I are going to convey a lot of the same message. In fact, this slide is almost exactly the same as what Debbie just showed you, except slightly different. So I'm just going to take you through the steps that you will take after your grant was reviewed yesterday. Of course, you all know exactly what day your grant's being reviewed. And so the first thing you do is you refresh Commons like 1,000,000 times. You basically wear out the button on your computer. Then you get your score and you have some reaction to it. Happiness, sadness, confusion, who knows? It takes a while for your summary statement to be released until you have a better idea. Here's my cat, it's gonna help me with this, of what that means. It'll take a couple of weeks for you to get your summary statement back. First, like Debbie said, read it through and let yourself be mad at the reviewers who are obviously all dumb and don't understand how much of a genius you are and how great your proposal is. But then, as Debbie said, leave it for a few days, think about it, and then I think you'll probably read it again and realize that they're probably actually not that dumb. They probably have a lot of good points that you need to address. After you've had that sort of run through of emotions, then you can email your program officer who's listed at the top of the page and ask for a meeting. Definitely send an email to your program officer, don't call them. Especially during the pandemic, I don't even know if my phone number is hooked up to anything. So an email is the way to go. If they don't reply to you the first time, that's not a personal affront, just email them again and try to set up a meeting. And then we'll give you some feedback. So here are the kinds of things, why I tell people it's really important to talk to their program officer. You would be surprised at how few people actually go ahead and contact their program officer, but it can be really useful to you in a number of ways. I have listened to probably more grants just this council round get reviewed than you have written in your entire life. So I have some experience in listening to reviews and interpreting them. A big thing is I didn't write this application, so I'm not emotionally attached to it. And I talk to people sometimes, they read their summary statement, they find a sentence or 2 sentences in there that really make them mad that the reviewer said and fixate on that. And that may not have been the most important issue in the application. And it's really important for you to know what the score driving issues were versus the ones that, you know, get you the most upset when you read them. So I can help you figure those things out because I've listened to the review. And even if I haven't listened to the review, I can usually pick those things out of a summary statement. Another thing that's really important about contacting your program officer is it helps you get on my radar. That's really important for you. If I know about you and I know about your specific situation and I know what's going on and you've talked to me, I'm thinking about your application more than I'm thinking about those that I haven't interacted with anybody and no one has reminded me of since the review. So I think it really benefits you to have that sort of interaction with the program director. I asked my friends what kinds of things would they want to know about interacting with a program officer, and one of the things that they said was, you know, what do you do when your program officer doesn't respond to your email? Sometimes this is what my schedule looks like during the week. And just like you, we get really busy and it becomes hard to respond to emails. So do not hesitate to follow up with another email or 3 other emails until you get a response. It's our job to talk to you. We're totally happy to do it, but we have a lot of other commitments as well. So definitely keep trying until you get in touch with us. Sometimes people will say, well, I talked to a program officer once and they gave me advice, but you know, then the reviewer still hated the application afterwards. And I just want to remind you that your program officer is not a reviewer and they're also not psychic. So they can give you general advice, but we can't really know what's going to happen the day of review. So we just do our best to give you some help. Some of the things that I talk to people about considering when they're doing a resubmission, Debbie sort of alluded to this too. If you think you included something in your application, but they missed it or they didn't get it, that's annoying, but it happens. And what that tells you is that you didn't explain it clearly or well enough. Debbie mentioned the reviewers on the study section are not all experts in your field. I think people sometimes think that when they submit applications, but they may have a very general understanding of what you're doing. And it's easy for them to miss things. So you have to make sure that everything is presented clearly and explained well to a general audience for them to get those key things. When you do your resubmission, make sure that you've taken the time to address the primary score driving issues in a very thoughtful way. When they review your application, one of the things that they're going to talk about is how well did you address the comments of the previous review. So it's really important that you've done this in the application. Even if you think that the reviewers were totally stupid and missed the mark, you cannot let them know that in your intro to the resubmission. I don't usually look at the introductions that people send, but I've seen a couple in my time where I've had to be like, hey, you don't want to write it like that. Nothing is going to put a reviewer in a worse mood when they read your application than an introduction to the revised application that is anything less than thank you for all of your amazing and wonderful feedback. I really appreciated it. Sometimes people will talk to me about asking if they can get their application reassigned to a new study section, and I generally advise not to do that because even if these people totally didn't get it, you know exactly what they didn't get and you know exactly what they don't like. So if you try to go to another study section on your resubmission, that's a whole new set of people who are going to find a whole new set of things that they don't like about your application, and you will have no opportunity to respond to that. So in most cases, I think it is to your benefit to stay where you are and just revise according to what that specific panel told you the first time. Sometimes I will talk to people about whether or not this was the right grant mechanism for them. Sometimes I will see people write an R01 and it's too risky, and I advise them to think about how they could break it up. So could you take the riskiest part of it and put it into an R21? Or someone is developing something that is too boring, right? And so there are other mechanisms like an R03 where you can have it's kind of a small amount of money, but it can fund a very small defined project. So sometimes the mechanism that you chose isn't the right one, and I can help you sort of talk through that. And then the question of, should I even bother resubmitting this application? I can tell you that it definitely won't be funded if you don't resubmit. So in most cases, I think it's worth resubmitting, but it does depend on what part they didn't like. And I think that's kind of what Debbie was talking about with the different criterion scores. The approach is probably the biggest driver of your overall priority score that you get from the reviewers. And that's the easiest one to fix. They love talking about experimental details, so they will give you a lot of very detailed feedback, usually about what kinds of things they didn't like about your approach, and you can fix those. The problem comes when they just are bored by it. They found the significance to be low or the innovation to be low, and sometimes that can be harder to overcome. So those are the kinds of things that I talk to people about. Debbie and I were talking before this about what we would discuss, and I thought I would mention the formal appeal of review process, which actually happens very, very infrequently. I've been a program officer for 13 years, I think, and I've only had one of these that whole time. You can Google and you'll find I think it's in the grants policy statement, how you do a formal appeal of review and what the criteria are. But there are 4 specific things that are acceptable basis for a formal appeal. And you have to write a letter that describes what went wrong in the review and which one of these 4 things it applies to. So those are evidence of bias on the part of one or more reviewers. And that, when we're talking about bias, we're talking about a real significant thing, like you got in a public fight with somebody at a conference once, and now you think that they have a bias against you. That's not a normal sort of conflict. Conflict of interest on the part of one or more reviewers, that's the same kind of thing, but that's a more formalized thing. And in the grants policy statement, it tells you exactly what that means when we say conflict of interest. Lack of appropriate expertise within the review group, and then factual errors made by one or more reviewers that could have altered the outcome of review substantially. A lot of times what you think is a factual error, people who are less emotionally invested in your review would call a difference of scientific opinion, and that is not an acceptable basis of review or of appeal. So what happens after you submit this letter? The review staff who ran the study section and the program person who's assigned to the application review your letter and decide whether or not they agree with you and what you said. And then we go to council, and council will look at the letter. The program officer and the review officer will talk to them about what they thought about it. And then council will either decide to recommend that it be re-reviewed. So it'll be reviewed as is by the same review group or a different one. It's going to depend on what the basis of appeal was. Or they'll concur with the initial review and deny your appeal. So like I said, this happens very rarely. I've only done one and it was not successful. So in general, I think this is a real last case thing. The other thing about doing a formal appeal is you have to wait for it to be re-reviewed. So now you're wasting time, right? You could have been working on revising and resubmitting the application. Now you've got to wait for that to be reviewed and go through council again. In most cases, I think it's a better use of your time to just revise and resubmit. I also wanted to show a couple more things before you go back to your slides, Debbie, that I think are just useful pieces of information for people. So when you're talking about revising and resubmitting an application, you know who the assigned program officer is because it's written right at the top of the summary statement. But a lot of times when you're starting out with your first submission, you want to talk to a program officer too, and it's hard to know who the right person to talk to is. You can look at the different institute websites and you can see the different program officers, what areas of science they cover. Some institutes will have a specific page that breaks down science areas and tells you who their contact is. Another thing that you can do is use the NIH Reporter. If you're not using NIH Reporter, you need to get familiar with it because there's a lot of great information in there. It's basically a database of all of the funded NIH grants. You can find out things like what are the institutes that fund research like my research, what program officers are assigned to those applications, and what other researchers are out there already funded to do research like what I'm proposing to do. So you would put your text into this matchmaker box on the reporter and run the search for similar program officials. And then you would get a list of program officials who are assigned to applications that are most similar to what you submitted. So I don't even remember which one I searched about here, but luckily I came up as one of the top program officials in this application. So that's one way to sort of figure out who the right person to talk to might be. And then the other thing that's really important is understanding who's going to be reviewing the application, what their expertise is, what kinds of things that study section sees. So this is another tool that a lot of people don't know about. It's called the assisted referral tool. You basically paste in the text of your specific aims and run it through this program, and it will show you the top hits for study sections that what you've written is most likely to be assigned to. So you can look at that, you can look at the roster and see exactly who's on that panel. So both of these are really useful tools for people who are putting together applications. That's the end of my slide. So Debbie, you can go back to yours.
I didn't even know about the assisted referral tool. That's really cool. From the investigator, you know, you have to have a plan of what you're going to talk about to your program officer. And so a good program officer, after you email them, they're going to read your summary statement before you call. And they will really allow a two-way communication of the strengths and the weaknesses. And I'm really lucky and fortunate that I have a program officer that is very down to earth and is a wonderful communicator and gets back to me right away and tells it just how it is. I like that. So if your application was discussed, then the program officer may have taken notes, and these notes are invaluable because they're going to complement the formal critiques, because there's the written word and there's also the dynamic of the three reviewers in the room, and the program officer knows what the tenor of the review because they heard it, and so they can communicate those notes that they have that are not in your summary statement. Okay. Now, if you're streamlined, of course, then you don't have an oral discussion that the program officer can refer to. But you should ask your program officer one of these four scenarios and see what they think after they have read your summary statement. And so Lisa talked about these. So you can resubmit as an A1, okay? And in that case, you want to make sure that all your critiques are addressable. You're going to the same panel, not necessarily the same reviewers. Sometimes they can keep them. Sometimes they like to switch it up. Sometimes the same reviewers are not available. But it is the same study section. Okay, so that's one choice. You could send it back in as a brand new application. So you have a clean slate. So if you have critiques that are hard to address, but you can incorporate those when you rewrite this new application, then that may be a better strategy depending on what the nature of the critiques are. You can switch to a completely different funding mechanism. So as Lisa mentioned, maybe you have less pilot data, maybe your idea is less global or less impactful, so it needs a different mechanism. Maybe there is a inter-institute mechanism or specific request for application that your program officer knows about but is not out there yet, and so they can help guide. Often they will take your specific aims and they'll kind of do the old-fashioned method of this assisted referral tool, and they'll share your specific aims and maybe your summary statements with their colleagues to see if they can find a better mechanism. And you can switch to a different institute. I asked about that once because I am funded by NIDCD, the National Institute of Deafness, I was up too late last night trying to do a non-competitive renewal report. Anyway, I'm funded by the NIDCD, which is the deafness and communication disorder. So it's olfaction and taste. But my work also deals with obesity. And so I thought, well, maybe I know some colleagues that are in that institute, and maybe I really would have a more favorable light of some of the things that I'm currently trying to do, because they're stretching outside of my domain of smell and taste. But then you lose the track record of your accomplishment and the knowledge of your work. So there's a lot of things that you got to balance. Now, the complication with a streamlined application, if you don't get scored, you do have the negative baggage of the previous review. And the most difficult thing is that reviewers may not have included everything that they thought was wrong with the application. You know, it was in the lower 50 to 60% of the pile. Maybe they didn't have enough time. Maybe they didn't want to bother. And maybe they just kind of glossed over some of the things that were wrong. So you only have what they wrote. You don't have everything, okay? So, and then some reviewers are reluctant to jump their scores from the lower half to the top 10%. So what do you do? Okay. If you're a young investigator and timing is really important, and if you think, well, maybe I should go back to a clean slate because I have too many things that are wrong and not completely addressable, then if you do that, you may have to go through another round of revisions, but you can simultaneously submit to the NIH and also a different federal agency at the exact same time. And we did that in our lab once. My postdoc had submitted an R03, R21 young investigator type mechanism, and he got critiques that were very lengthy to address. They could be addressed, but it required a lot of optimization of stimulating neurons with light and making new mouse models, which takes a long time. And so he did those experiments, but at the same time, he submitted to the American Heart. And he got funded on that, and he used that while he then corrected the NIH grant. And then he ended up getting that. So it was able to piggyback one to the other. Of course, if you do these exactly simultaneously, you can't accept both federal projects, both projects under two federal agencies. You got to choose. All right, so now this is the hardest part, is how to write the introduction. And Lisa said she hasn't read too many introductions, but I really feel that the single most reason for failure of an A1 application is ignoring the reviewer. And Lisa did say that. I mean, it's kind of like you just spent 3 days picking apart your student's manuscript. You give them back all the critiques, and they come back with another manuscript to another journal, and they don't put in anything that you said, and you're pissed, okay? So you've got to thank the reviewers. You've got to identify the previous submission, that should say date, not data, date and panel, and then start organizing it, concentrating on the most important critiques and in the order of the summary statement, because the next 3 reviewers are going to have to follow your summary statement, and you don't want it to be all over the place. You don't want to take the most important critique and then bundle it across and jump back and forth between reviewers. That makes it really difficult to understand. Okay. You can directly requote the reviewers so that you don't confuse their intent, and I'll show you my introduction that I wrote. But you don't have to do this if it takes up too many lines, because you only have 1 page. And so I really feel that the specific aims is the most important document for an A1, but the introduction is the most important document for the A1. Have colleagues read it. Have members of your team read it. And write it early on. So after your emotion is gone, You've got 2 weeks. You've got a nice open window where you can really think. Write out that entire introduction, even if it's longer than a page, because then you know everything that you need to address and what experiments need to be redone, what wording needs to be done, who do you need to get a letter to support your environment. Whatever you need to fix, you've got a roadmap now to fix it. Okay. If new pilot data are not obtained for a particular experiment, it fails a week before your grant is redue, then you revise it, and you just keep revising that introduction all the way up to the morning of your resubmission. As I mentioned before, you got to take the high road. You don't want to criticize the reviewer, and you don't want to really dwell on minor corrections. Just fix all of those things. You used to have to put in a different font. You have to draw a little line down every little sentence that you changed. You don't have to do anything like that anymore. Just address it all. Okay. So let's take a look at mine. At the very beginning, I'm thanking. Then you can see all my reviewer 1 comments are all in one block. Then here's my reviewer 2 comments. And then here's my reviewer 3 comments. Okay. That way they can go back and they can follow the previous reviewer sets pretty easily. Okay. Now let me bring this up so you can actually read it. Okay. Now I know you can read it. Okay, so here is the last study section that it went to. So you can see it identified. You can see when it was, that it wasn't sitting around for a long period of time, or maybe it did have to sit around because you had to do something very technically challenging. Okay, and I appreciated the reviewer's enthusiasm for our proposed experiments, our promising preliminary data, the impact of our goals to understand X. And now we outline the concerns as follows. So what I do is I take this exactly from the summary statement. They wrote that sentence and I pop it in. And then I address that with italics right behind it. Okay. So with this one, this was the number 1 critique. And it was not just from this reviewer, but it was from other reviewers, is that they wanted to know if there were extraneous effects that could occur when I did a CRISPR genome editing experiment. And so I addressed this with lots of data. So we put in more data, and I really tried to take the high road with this. I told them it is consistent with our hypothesis to test this. We have looked for this before, and here's our publication. So I didn't say, did you not read my publications? They're right here. This is what, but I just state, here's our publications. We've observed no changes before. And then I just go on pleasantly, okay? So going through, you can see where I put in new data. This was in my global statement. So you see R1 and R2 here. They were concerned that one of my 4 mice that I was going to use was not available. So I address this and I tell them that we've contacted the company. Thank you for the good idea to include a table showing the advantages and caveats. We have added this, okay? Some of this was words. Let's see. Then this reviewer here wanted me to do some experiments that didn't have anything to do with my hypothesis. Like, it was just really stupid. But of course I don't say that. I say, these interesting experiments are outside the design of our hypothesis, but would be curious to explore whether, but it would be curious to explore this, okay? And so I say, but we're using the channel for something else. We've previously examined this and we've published this, okay? So you just, you don't downgrade the reviewer in any way, okay? Here the reviewer said there was something that was missing in my methods, and I say we apologize this and we incorporated them. Boom, straight to the point, okay? Let's see, let's look down here. Some of these are little tiny things, and so I just paraphrase by using brackets. I say we've collected a lot of data in this regard. they were asking about something about exercise, and one of my reviewers had already published this. So I just say, typically exercise does not affect this. See my letter from my expert, and she addressed it in her letter. So there's ways that you can stretch outside this one page limitation. This was the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and it was something that Lisa addressed, and this was a little bit different of a twist, because I've never had to rebut something because something was wrong. But my program officer, about 10 years ago, I got a critique, and the first two reviewers were very competitive for being funded, and the third one was really outside the domain, and it wasn't as knowledgeable, it wasn't as a helpful one. And so she asked me to do it. And so I had discordant reviews. And so my PO asked me to write a 3-page rebuttal to counsel. And I did that. And then she shared that summary with counsel. She also wanted me to give it to her way ahead of time, and I did. And it was tough because the reviews came out, I think it was a few days before Christmas. And she told me that I had to have it to her by January 6th. So my whole family was traveling, and then my son had an accident. So I stayed home with my son, and then I had 6 days to do this. It was awful. I got it done, and she shared it with counsel, and it was funded. So, and then this was the other mechanism that Lisa talked about. If there's some kind of unethical treatment, or if your reviewers are just completely unknowledgeable or wrong. And I didn't have that case. I just had 3 very discordant reviewers that then put my score like on the fence. And so my program officer wanted to explain that to counsel so that if there was a pay line that would incorporate the other side of the fence, then it would catch me. So that's everything that I had. And I'm sure Lisa and I are happy to answer questions that you guys have.
Hi, Graham McDougall from the College of Nursing. I resubmitted an R21, and it stayed unscored. So I got 2 unscored, and I looked at all the analysis of discussing it with the team and laid out the scores like you said, and it seems that 1 or 2 of the reviewers were switched from the first to the second review. And so I think that's where some of the discordance came in, because where I might have scored, a 2 in one category, the second time it went in, there was a 6. And it was not going to change. It was like innovation or significance. So it just left me feeling kind of unfairly evaluated.
Well, like Debbie said, your reviewers are not likely to be the same every time, so that's very normal. They will see what the comments from the last reviewers were, but they will not necessarily be the same people. And
you could see wild discrepancies in the scores like that?
I've had reviews who, even just this last week, who almost had a fundable score last time and then went to non-discussed. I mean, unfortunately, every time that it's reviewed is a different beast, really. And so that's one reason why I think it's better to resubmit to the same study section, because at least we have a general idea of what they don't like. Yeah. But yeah, unfortunately, that does happen a lot.
Yeah, and just one more comment. Do you think it's kind of the appropriate stylistic way to review a second application by commenting that the individual addressed the critique from the previous review? Most of them just ignored it, like it never happened, like there was never a previous review.
Right.
Right. So if you're going in as an A1, yeah, but if you go back in now, it's an A0. So you don't mention anything, and you don't even have to choose to address anything that your 2 rounds of review
Right.
adjust. Because it, like Lisa said, it may be a different composition of reviewers and they may not have the problem. But this is where you can probably gain some help from the program officer because you've got 2 sets of reviews now. And you've got to figure out what of that do you need to incorporate?
Mm-hmm.
And would, you know, the 21 is, I think in many aspects, the 21s are harder. They're easier to write, but they're harder to get. And they have a more competitive pay line than an RO1. So maybe you need to write a more focused RO1 or maybe a small grants program, something of that nature, and maybe ask your program officer about those other mechanisms. But certainly don't give up, because I know when I was a student and I got my first grant back, and it was a score, but it wasn't high enough for funding. And so I treated it just like any other scholarship. And I was like, oh, okay, I didn't get that scholarship. No big deal. And you know, but my PI, he was a long experienced grant writer, and he's just like, okay, now this is what we're going to do. And so you just got to get back on the horse.
Okay, great. Thank you all.
I just had a really quick practical question. When you said you have 37 months to resubmit, is that from your first submission, or is that from when you get your summary statements back?
Lisa, do you know exactly? I looked it up last night because I thought somebody was going to ask me. So I don't know, Beth. I think it's probably from the summary statement, but yeah, we have to look that up.
The other thing to remember is that in the intervening 37 months, your review panel now is totally different, right? So
No, I know.
If you can, it does help to shorten up the time between your original and your resubmission.
Yeah. And I was looking online to see what their rationale for 37 months, because I thought it was an odd number. Why didn't they just say like 3 years? But they said the science advances too. And so that was why NIH made it like that, because then they thought you weren't going to be on top of the wave if you were still proposing. But you know, okay, so my husband submitted a grant and got funded, and he pulled data out of notebooks from 10 years ago. And so this was, I mean, he was so far out in the field that it wasn't appreciated until now, and he just got funded with that. So I mean, who knows where the wave sits.
Quick question, how much does this process differ between like an individual investigator proposal like an R series or in a larger scale center type like a U series grant?
So usually you can only submit that through a specific funding announcement. So most of the time, those only have one receipt date, and you don't have a chance to resubmit. The other thing that would be different in an RFA is that program staff have more latitude in choosing which applications to fund. It's not necessarily by a pay line, so it's really important to talk to a program officer if you're applying for something like that. In terms of, so I don't know if that totally answers your question, or if there was some other sort of angle to it that you're thinking of.
Suppose the particular opportunity for a U series did allow multiple resubmissions.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, is there a different approach you'd take?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the same kind of thing is going to happen, right? You're going to get a summary statement back. It's going to tell you what that review panel thought of it. You should contact the program officer and talk to them about it too and resubmit it. I think in general, that would be a pretty similar process. There may be specific things that you would need to address that are important for that announcement that are not necessarily important for another research grant, but otherwise I think the overall process is probably pretty similar.
I've never reviewed for U series, but I have reviewed for training grants, and those are very large, more complex mechanisms that do get revised. And so that introduction, instead of it being a 1-page, it's a 3-page. So they give you more time and more space to explain your revisions. But what's complicated with a revision of a training grant is that you have trainees that are in the middle of their stipends, they're mid-year. And so you've got, commitments to scholars, which it's not just like research supplies and they're in the middle of everything and there's more than one, that you're affecting many, many labs. And so I have heard more frequently now that people start submitting their training grant proposals after 3 years just to make a buffer zone for the resubmission process. Then it gets really challenging because you only have 3 years of productivity to convince the reviewers instead of like 4 or 4.5. So I had a colleague who they had eliminated a lot of the supplemental information and many kinds of extraneous materials that you would put in a training program, like flyers and syllabuses and all of this add-on, and so she had put all of this in appendix after they had told her not to do that, and so then they didn't even review her proposal. And so she was stuck because those things only go in once a year. And so she had to wait to the entire next year. And so then she had to go to both her institution and the NIH to ask for joint sponsorship because these were ear, nose, throat physicians and they were stuck without salaries. And so, yeah, it can get very complicated in some of these bigger mechanisms when you start doing resubmissions. But, basically the thought process and the timing and the strategy and the dissecting apart of your summary statement is so critical. And I think that's all the same.
Make sure that you talk to somebody at the NIH before you submit your application. So what you talked about was overstuffing the application. That is something that will get you in trouble and will get your application withdrawn without review. Also, if you're submitting an application to a funding announcement that's got some specific criteria, you need to make sure that you've read it carefully, that you've talked to the program officer who's listed as the contact to make sure that it's appropriate for that, because we send things back all the time and I hate doing it because I know how hard you've worked on it. But it's really important to talk to somebody at all steps of this process to make sure that you're on track.
And I think for the May application cycle, maybe May 24, maybe May 25, somewhere in there, the BioSketch has changed and the other support has changed. So I've heard the citations are in reverse chronological order. And there's some names of new things. I don't know why they keep changing. Yeah, so I just heard from a colleague of mine who was preparing a big application and had just gotten 25 BioSketches from his colleagues and he's sending them all back because he didn't see that. It's kind of a bummer.
Debbie and Lisa, thank you so much for giving us your time today and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a great week, and we hope to see you at future webinars.